All right, welcome to Canto per Canto, or Canto per Canto, depending on how you prefer to pronounce it. My name is Hannah Schmidt. I am not a medieval historian. I am a university administrator who really loves Dante, and I am here with a very good friend, Adam Camiolo, to talk about Purgatorio 18.
Thank you, Hannah. As Hannah just mentioned, my name is Adam Camiolo. I'm also a non-professional medieval historian, just a medievalist hobbyist, and a former student of Ron Herzman and Bill Cook at Geneseo.
And as am I, and that's actually how Adam and I came to both the Dante Society and to Canto per Canto, is that we both were former TAs and took many, many Dante classes with both Ron and Bill. And I like medievalist hobbyist, by the way. I think that's a good expression.
It's on my business card now, actually.
Yeah, it's a good subtitle. So Canto 18 in Purgatorio. So we, as a brief orientation for where we are, Dante the Pilgrim has traveled through the bowels of hell and is now climbing up the mountain of Purgatorio with his guide, Virgil, the poet. And right now, they're on the fourth terrace in Purgatorio. And Purgatorio, much like both Inferno and Paradiso, is divided by virtue, essentially, or divided by sin, depending on how you want to look at it. The fourth terrace in Purgatorio is for the terrace of the slothful. And we are in the middle of a conversation between Dante and Virgil right now, where Dante is asking Virgil about what is love, which, by the way, was also going to be another title for this episode. But we didn't think that Baby Don't Hurt Me would be a good subtitle. So let's talk a little bit about what happened in Purgatorio 17 and how Virgil is framing love for Dante.
Yeah. So as Hannah mentioned, Dante and Virgil are in a conversation right now. And Dante, as he happens to get a couple times in this canto, is tired. They're slowing down. They're deciding to kind of take a break from the spiritual journey. And Dante asks Virgil, what is love? And Virgil, who's been a great teacher so far, gives him a couple examples and gives him an explanation that, as we find out through the rest of the discussion, Dante doesn't quite love. He thinks it's kind of lacking. And Virgil gives a couple examples to Dante that are kind of the consequences of loving incorrectly, such as too much or too little or loving the wrong things. And he kind of describes like the negative impacts of love. So it's kind of the negative space of love, if you think about it. And he describes things that could be considered, envy or fear or pride from loving too much, and, how it affects how you interact with your neighbors and yourself, and essentially kind of takes a negative shape.
It's almost like Virgil, just to jump in, it's almost like Virgil is trying, because he's having a hard time framing what love is, he's talking more about what love isn't, because it's easier for him to talk about it in that sense.
Yeah.
Which leads us to 18, too.
Yeah, and it makes kind of a sense, personally, the way I've been reading it, because Virgil is, a denizen of the Inferno. He sees the negative impacts of love and how it drives people to sin and love wrongly. But that brings us to the beginning of 18, where Dante says, thanks, but like, now that I know this, what is love? Baby, don't hurt me.
Right. Yeah. And I think that, Adam, one thing that you pointed out too is like, this is where we really start to see the limits of Virgil's perspective. As a, denizen of limbo, Virgil this is a new territory for him. He's familiar with Inferno. He can give Dante like the full guided, dose into tour, but he's learning about Purgatorio as he's moving up the mountain with Dante. Like, this is new ground. And Dante is also, they've established this relationship, this like teacher-student relationship over the course of this journey. And now in this beginning part of 18, Dante's like, I don't want to just keep asking you questions, but also I need to know more about love.
Which brings us to the passage here where Dante kind of right out of the gate says like, thank you, but really, what do you mean? Starting on line 10. So I said, Master, my seeing is so enlivened by your light that I am able to understand clearly the outlines of your explanation. Therefore, I pray you, beloved gentle Father, explain to me what love is as you refer to it, every good action and its opposite. Turn toward me, he said, the sharpened beams of your intelligence, and you will see the misleading way of the blind who say, follow me. Which is kind of it sets up kind of like a punchline for later in the canto, where Virgil is saying, don't listen to these other guys. I know what this is. I know what love is and what the explanation is. Don't pay attention to people who would mislead you. And as we'll get on later in the conversation, we'll talk about what that punchline actually is. But this kind of leads me to the point of the conversation where I want to ask Hannah, why did you want to read this? And why are you reading Purgatorio right now?
Well, I think you and I, over the course of our friendship, have talked a lot about how Purgatorio is our favorite canticle. I think it's just the most relatable. Like Dante is asking these questions that like Cosmopolitan magazine is trying to answer every month. And it's such a human question. And it also, I think, is such like the relationship between Dante and Virgil here is also so just relatable and understandable. Like they have, and I think it's interesting too, because, our relationship with, Ron Hersman, for example, our Dante mentor, and like how that has changed as he's continued to be our mentor, but also we're no longer his students. And, I think that Purgatorio is such a relatable canticle. And I think the question here, like Dante asking, like, what is love? And like, how do you love well? That's the center not only of, this canto and this canticle and this entire poem, but also the center of the lives of all of Dante's readers, both in 1321 and now in 2021. It's central. Like this is the important question that everyone wants to know, and that everyone in, whether they're Inferno and in Purgatorio or in Paradiso is trying to answer more effectively, both for Dante and for themselves, is like, what does it mean for me as an individual and as a member of a collective body and as a member of, God's children and all of these other groups? There are so many subgroups in this poem. It's like, what does it mean for me to love and to love well, and not that disordered love that, you were talking about from Purgatorio 17. I think one of the things I also really love is there's just so much affection in this canto, between both Dante and Virgil. They clearly really care about each other and they want to help the other one out in other ways. Mm-hmm. Dante doesn't want to overburden Virgil. He also doesn't want to, make him feel bad about the limits of his own knowledge at this point. I think it's very sweet, but
yeah. I mean, the first line of the canto is, and I'm going with the Long Island pronunciation of canto, by the way, but the first line is the exalted teacher, and it's it starts out that way, and by the end of the canto, you see Virgil is kind of like, he's described as like a burdened shade, and like he's also tired, and like you really kind of see the limitations of what he can do. But throughout, there's still affection, and there's also towards the end references and hints that Dante still sees Virgil in this exalted position, like as portrayed by having characters from the Aeneid show up. Mm-hmm. It's clearly a big deal. Virgil.
Yeah. How? What about this particular canto and this particular canticle, especially in, we're recording this still in the midst of the pandemic. What is this? how does this speak to you, especially during this particular time? I know, for example, that you have been thinking about Purgatorio a lot this past year.
Yes. So, as a non-professional Dante fan, this was the first thing academically that I ever really loved. I really loved learning about Dante, and having great teachers was a huge part of that. Maybe the primary thing that got me really interested in this. And while I didn't go into it professionally and continue to learn about it, it is something I took with me for the rest of my life. And at the beginning of 2020, I had married, my own personal Beatrice. And I was changing jobs and getting ready to move and go into a different phase of my own life. And then March 2020 happened, and the whole world essentially flipped upside down. And at that point, I was living in a completely different part of the state. I was away from all my friends, my old job, and it was just my wife and I and my dog in a small apartment where we felt very isolated, like everybody else did in the country. And it was easy for me to relate to somebody who was exiled from his own homeland, Dante, obviously. And it helped me connect with kind of like that universal feeling of like going on a spiritual journey in exile, and also made me, think about what it was like to be a college student again. One of the reasons why I connected with Purgatorio so much in college was because Hannah and I studied in Western New York in the winter. So that was pretty relatable.
Yeah, the dark times of the soul for our journeys. Western New York.
Mm-hmm. But the first book I turned to when I was stuck in quarantine working from home was Purgatorio. And it was something that I was really happy to be able to pick back up and re-enter and relearn from. And the edition I read from was the W.S. Merwin, which was appealing to me because he's just a poet, not a medievalist poet or a medieval scholar, and it made it more accessible to me. And two non-professional people talking about Dante, that felt like the way to go.
Yeah, definitely. I think, and also because poetry and the limits of language and the limits of like courtly love poetry are so often a theme in Dante. So to be able to use a poet's interpretation of Dante feels really cool. So I want to go back a little bit though to Virgil's limited perspective of love and how this dynamic is so interesting. Like between one thing that you pointed out, which I just think was excellent math and geography on your part, is this particular canto's location in the poem itself. Like this is the first canto where Dante and Virgil are actually closer to paradise now than to hell. And because of that, we're starting to really see the limits of Virgil's perspective. He's been a little bit hobbled throughout all of Purgatorio because this is new territory for him. But now he's like really starting to get into unfounded territory. And, after his description of love, he immediately says, but, you really should ask Beatrice about this, see her.
That is a really cool human moment where like, he doesn't really do it too often at all, but he's just like, by the way, Beatrice knows more about this than I do. So save that for her.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I really love about this section too is that even though Virgil's understanding of love is somewhat limited, he's really trying to like demonstrate that love to Dante as much as he possibly can. So a lot of throughout this entire poem, a lot of the time Dante equates love with attention. And this whole first section, of the canto is he keeps using words like I'm reading from the Durling Martinez translation. He was gazing attentively into my eyes. And Dante says, my sight becomes so keen in your light and direct toward me the sharp eyes of your intellect. And then, a little later, he talks about like the captured mind. Like for Virgil, love is all about attention, and because he is paying such careful attention to Dante and is demonstrating that love toward him as much as he possibly can, that's why he's trying to give him this explanation, even though he's tired, Dante's tired, and he also doesn't really know. He's like, I don't really know, but I'm really trying, not because, he has the humility to say, I don't really know at the end. Like, you need to ask Beatrice, but I want to do this because this is like how I can demonstrate the limits of my love for you.
Yeah, and those limitations are kind of highlighted in the image at the very end, where the other souls in purgatory sprint by Virgil, leaving him behind. As the kind of punchline to what we mentioned earlier, is that the blind who claim to lead have actually now passed them and surpassed them. And they're experiencing this love, this newly expanded love that they weren't able to experience in their life on Earth. And I think it's described as kind of like stretching out like a muscle that you hadn't known you had. And they're joyful and they're jumping around and they literally can't even stop to talk. They're feeling so like happy and overwhelmed that they just run by and briefly explain, like, I'm so-and-so from San Zeno, goodbye. Yeah. And it ends. So it grounds the limitations of Virgil in action and joy and dialogue. And it's kind of a very interesting way to end it, especially considering Virgil's journey is ending soon as well.
Yeah. And I think it also is just such an interesting contrast between the very start of the poem where we have, or the start of, the canto, where Dante is like, razor focused on Virgil and this conversation that they're happening. And then towards the end of the canto, he kind of gets like into this dream-like state, where everything's a little bit hazier. And and it's also, and even that is contrasted by these people that are running past them, like so full of their love. I also think this canto is so good at preempting, what's to come for Dante the Pilgrim, because, one of the things that I think we talk about a lot, when we talk about the Commedia, is how, like, yes, it's this poem about salvation and it's got Italian politics and really intense theology that I still don't understand even after, how many years of reading Dante. But at the heart of it, it's a love poem. And I mean, at the heart of this canto, the very center lines of this canto are about how Beatrice understands love and how she's going to explain that to Dante. And Beatrice, it says this is line 73 in the Derling-Martinez translation. This noble power Beatrice understands as free choice, and therefore see that you remember it if she speaks to you about it. It's like what Dante is going to learn from Beatrice is what this poem is leading towards and what this is all about. And this is like such a good teaser trailer for that.
And it should also be noted that Virgil's explanation of what love is probably the least romantic version of love in the whole poem. It's just like, it's when you like a book or an object and your soul likes it, and that's it.
Yeah. Well, and on that note, Adam, I think that we're about at our time. So, Adam, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you for inviting me. This was great.
And thank you to the Dante Society of America and to NYU and for making Canto per Canto happen. Take care, everybody.